Welcome back to Keep Creative, in conversation with Enkel, and Lydia Brearley is here with me again. How are you doing, Lydia? Thank you for joining me.
I'm good, thanks, Angie. Nice to see you.
Great, and thank you so much for your time again. And just going through, really, we're going to recap a couple of headlines this week, aren't we? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the first one is Shein's annual profits decline. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on there?
So obviously, earlier this year on I think it was the 6th or 7th of Jan, Shein were in UK Parliament, and that really shone a spotlight on the risk associated with their supply chains and their lack of transparency. And, you'd kind of think that any business that was looking to float on the London Stock Exchange, that, they'd be looking to sort of really demonstrate that transparency. But actually what we saw in that session was actually they were really kind of very unwilling to disclose much about their supply chains. What that did was it actually really raised awareness, not only in the industry about the astronomical scale of Shein, but also the subsequent environmental impact and the impact on supply chains of a brand at that scale.
And I guess Shein has long been criticised for environmental and their ethical impact. I guess do declining profits and a challenging IPO, does that mean kind of the model of fast fashion, the ultra fast fashion, is starting to lose momentum, perhaps?
So what we saw in the news last week was that actually their sales have dropped dramatically in 2024 by about 40%. And what we also saw was that they have disclosed that they've found 2 cases of child labour in 2024, and they had actually found 2 cases of child labour in 2023. So what that kind of shows is that actually there hasn't really been kind of much progress within their supply chain, which is obviously really concerning. The other thing that's really interesting to note is that their valuation is really being questioned. So they're originally being valued at about 50 billion, and actually now they're under pressure to reduce that as low as 30 billion. And obviously, from an investor point of view, a lot of the risks that we're kind of seeing in the supply chain is really concerning from an investor point of view and from a stakeholder point of view.
Really, the ultra fast fashion model, it does look like it's starting to lose its momentum, and people are aware of this. Is there anything else going on that you can tell us about with Shein?
Yeah, so Shein do actually have a initiative called Evolution, and actually in the last few weeks we've seen latest initiatives around like production of denim and reduced impact in their supply chains from a manufacturing point of view. But I really question, how a brand as big as Shein, if we look at some of the biggest players in the market like H&M and Zara, Shein, they're actually about 60% bigger in terms of the annual volume that they put out on the market. So,
Yeah.
I don't know how a brand of that size and that scale can ever really be deemed sustainable.
Now, headline number 2, Lydia, just pulling out from your weekly newsletters, I think you've been covering quite a lot on the topic of EU Sustainability Regulation Rollback. Can you tell us a bit more what's happening in that sector? It seems like it's evolving still, right?
Yeah, so I mean, last week, LinkedIn was just absolutely full of the latest updates in the omnibus package, which was announced last week. But
Mm.
yeah, the key kind of headline here is that actually, it still very much is a proposal. So what needs to happen now is that it needs to be submitted to the European Parliament and Council for consideration and adoption. Once that happens, which could take several months, it will be entered into force after it actually appears and is published in the EU journal. So, there's lots of kind of noise around this, but as I say, it's still a proposal. What sort of another of the key headlines here is that actually it's about the EU reducing the regulatory obligations and complexity, which is potentially hindering business growth.
How might this impact global fashion brands and their commitment to responsible sourcing and circularity?
So essentially, if these proposals were to go ahead, it would actually remove around 80% of companies from the scope of CSRD, which is the reporting directive.
Mm.
So that would really kind of put the focus on the real kind of big, large companies who have or are likely to have a much bigger kind of impact on people and the environment. So obviously they'd be within the threshold in terms of complying. But for the smaller companies, obviously, potentially it could be a relief because they don't have to monitor, and measure this. But I think what's really important to note is that, this regulatory landscape is going to continue to evolve, and actually those companies that do kind of lead the way in sustainability, they will have a competitive edge. So it's really still important, I believe, to understand the kind of guiding principles of the legislations, and almost have like a moral compass of what's right and what wrong, what sort of due diligence they should be following, what the risks are, what the red flags are, and what they can put in place to sort of manage, monitor and mitigate those risks within their supply chains.
Yeah, so you said you can have all sorts of opinions on the policies, but the policies are meant to really be a guideline, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And the EU Green Deal goal about becoming climate neutral by 2050, that's still in place. I guess there's a lot of questions about how we can reach and how we can achieve that if businesses aren't actually accountable for actually delivering that. And there's a lot of questions about whether businesses will just kind of almost fall back into a sort of business as usual approach, and sort of park this almost as not a priority.
Yeah.
But as I say, I think the responsible businesses of the future, the businesses that want to have the investment and stakeholder investment in the future, they need to still really understand the kind of guiding principles and the moral principles beneath this, and try and implement and adopt that where they can within their businesses.
Yeah, and I think even just talking about Shein and the London IPO, and investors want to know they're investing in solid foundational businesses. The foundations of the businesses are solid, and I suppose these EU guidelines and policies are really there to structure that so that there's legislation around that and keeps everyone in that kind of right focus point.
Yeah. The other thing that's really important to note in this is that actually one of the key criteria or key headlines is that the due diligence would only be required with their like direct suppliers. And, in the industry, especially in the fashion industry, we know that actually the most adverse sort of risks and impacts are much further down the chain. So, in like material procurement, material processing, actually the manufacturing of the materials, not the actual garment processing, which is the final part, which is the tier 1 that we're talking about here. So it does mean that there's a potential risk that we're not really ever getting to the problem and the challenges in the industry, which is why with a lot of the work that I do, I try and kind of educate and implement toolkits and guiding principles so people can really understand what they should be looking for and what they should be implementing within their roles.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Lily, and a really good way to end that, to just round it up and just say, for more information on how you can help people structure their insights and understand a little bit more, really the education part of the materiality aspect is really key, isn't it? So they can find further information on you in the links and the shares that we'll do when we're distributing this information. So great. Well, that's it. They're just 2 headlines for this week, but thank you very much for kind of the synopsis on both of those, and we'll speak soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll see you soon. Thanks.
Take care. Thank you, Lydia.